Ihor Romanenko, founder of the Close the Skies of Ukraine Charity Fund, Lieutenant General, joins us. Ihor Alexandrovich, we are glad to welcome you. Glory to Ukraine.
Hello.
Glory to the heroes. Greetings to you as well.
Ihor Alexandrovich, according to the general staff reports, the situation remains as tense as ever in the Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka directions. Um, to what extent can we assume that if the Pokrovsk direction remains the hottest, still the hottest on the front, then what is the enemy trying to undertake here? To encircle the Sloviansk Kramatorsk agglomeration in a wider ring? Or are his offensive combat operations aimed at the borders of the Donetsk region, as Putin still wants to achieve?
Regarding the goal to capture the entire territory controlled by Ukraine in the Donetsk region, they, as Putin proclaimed, by the end of the year. But those are such Napoleonic plans, I would say. However, one way or another, we know that from spring to summer, they've been conducting offensive operations in the 2026 campaign. And the situation has been most tense over the last few weeks in those areas you listed. And in this case, Pokrovsk, Myrnograd. So from these cities to the north, which unfortunately they have already taken under control, they are advancing toward Dobrapilya. If you look at the map, taking into account the actions in Kostiantynivka, where the gray zone is actually already in the city, our forces control roughly the center and the logistics road to the northwest. Then it's clear from a military standpoint the desire, to carry out encirclements, around some areas of our resistance and defense, and on a wider scale. The main goals, certainly, and as the enemy themselves have stated, are Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And then from the direction of Slavyansk, moving further east, we can see that they are concentrating their efforts and actions there. This includes Lyman and the Oleksandrivka area. And from the Oleksandrivka area to Slavyansk, it's about 16 kilometers to the outskirts. But the actions are coming from the northeast. As you take a look at the map, as we discussed earlier, you can see that they are currently advancing north from the areas of Pokrovska, Lyman, and, for example, Oleksandrivka. And so they have these minor plans, let's say, small and large scale maneuvers, which are being dismantled by the units and divisions of the Ukrainian defense forces.
I wanted to clarify regarding the reports that Russia's pulling its air defenses away from facilities in the far north region. Well, to protect against Ukrainian drones, all of this is being moved, of course, to the Moscow region to provide cover there. But it turns out that S 300 and S 400 units are being redeployed, leaving exposed the very locations where nuclear submarines are stationed and repaired. How? Satellite imagery shows that about 24 air defense systems have disappeared from those areas. How do you assess the situation in the far north region? Is it possible that there's no threat there at all? And how safe is it, in principle, to leave submarines without S 300 and S 400 systems, given what's happening with the Russian Federation's shadow fleet? And overall, how do you assess this situation? Why is this being done?
This is a very significant trend. Our intelligence is tracking it, and it highlights that the much touted Russian air defense, especially around Moscow and the Moscow region, is failing to perform its intended functions to such an extent, in fact, that Putin was forced to give a public address regarding this very issue. He's never been one to take the heat for negative news or setbacks, usually delegating that to his team, people like Zakharova, Medvedev, Lavrov, or whoever else. But here he had to explain, first of all, what's going on with fuel and lubricant supplies across the entire country. And that's a very important point. And his reasoning was, well, that their relevant facilities are being hit, which leads to these consequences, as he stated. His second address focused on the current state of their air defense systems. In both instances, regarding fuel supplies and air defense, the solution he proposed to these problems was quite simple. We'll just produce more, and that's how we'll resolve these issues. Returning to air and missile defense, we see that even after the so called parade, they were forced to concentrate their efforts there and haven't moved them since. And since they can't quickly replace these systems due to the state of their defense industry, exactly what you mentioned is happening. They're pulling equipment from wherever they can. Well, what about the North in this case? Our strike capabilities, primarily attack drones, won't reach them as quickly, or maybe not at all, or at least not that fast. But it's happening. Our intelligence and our allies see this. So, in terms of air defense, these sites are being exposed. The air defense potential is dropping, and therefore, the opportunities for the Ukrainian defense forces to strike these targets are improving. This is a very important trend, and we see how it's being implemented. And even with that important consideration in mind, we can clearly observe those four distinct rings of defensive range that are positioned around the city of Moscow, each one situated at various different altitudes. And despite this ongoing and significant concentration of defensive systems, it still does not guarantee or ensure the complete and full protection of their capital city, as well as all the critical facilities and infrastructure located throughout the greater Moscow region. So, the task for Ukraine and its allies is to increase their strike capabilities and carry out effective attacks on military targets.
A new wave of mobilization in Russia after the State Duma elections. Volodymyr Zelensky considers such a scenario quite likely. Uh, in what form, in your opinion, could this mobilization take place? After all, it's a serious social challenge for Russian society. What could happen if this mobilization, well, let's say, isn't kept very quiet?
Well, they're already in the process of taking these kinds of covert actions, in terms of things like signing various contracts and also increasing the number of personnel involved in these operations. However, despite these efforts, it's still not proven to be very effective overall. That is, monthly recruitment for the Russian army is less than 30,000. And considering that, as we have seen in recent months, their losses have actually exceeded 35,000 people per month, which is a staggering and significant number. We can clearly see that during the ongoing offensive operations currently being carried out, especially in the Donetsk region, well, the situation we've already discussed in detail, this level of personnel, or rather this severe shortage of available troops, simply doesn't allow them to operate effectively or efficiently on the battlefield. In fact, it severely limits their ability to achieve their objectives and maintain any sort of sustained momentum in their operations. And we see that the plans for this spring summer campaign of 2024 are already failing in many respects, both in terms of timing and objectives. So that's why Putin and his team are looking for a solution to this issue. But considering, and I agree with you, the growing social tension among the common people in society, it's likely that if they go through with it, and it really looks like they're preparing to, after their Duma elections on September 18th to 20th, the plans are for, say, up to 500,000. Of course, if this is to happen, it won't be all at once, but by the end of the year. But one way or another, it's a serious resource for escalation and further actions to continue conducting, well, now most likely not a special military operation. Peskov has already given the appropriate signals there that this is a war. And why is this being done? First, to show once again for propaganda purposes that they are not fighting Ukraine, or not just Ukraine, but generally, Europe and NATO countries. And on the other hand, in order to carry out at least a partial mobilization, not to mention a full one, they need martial law. That is, to define it as a war. And after that, to carry out this kind of recruitment of their citizens, into the armed forces of the Russian Federation.